Dear students, let us discuss about the pharynx. The pharynx is an organ concerned with both digestion and respiration. So it belongs to both the digestive and respiratory pathways. This will be discussed into several components. Among the series of lectures on pharynx, in this lecture, we will discuss about the extent, divisions and communications. The pharynx is a funnel-shaped musculo-membranous tube concerned with the digestive and respiratory functions. So it belongs to both digestive and respiratory systems, and its walls consist of skeletal muscles that are lined with mucous membrane. So it has a funnel shaped one and it is communicating with both the digestive and respiratory systems. Now have a look at the sagittal section of the head and neck, wherein you can see the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the hard palate separating the two, and the cervical vertebra you are seeing. So the pharynx is situated behind the nose, mouth and larynx. So it is lying posterior to the nasal and oral cavities, superior to larynx. This is the larynx and the esophagus. It is anterior to cervical vertebra. So we are seeing its communication with the nasal cavity and its communication with the oral cavity and with the larynx. So this is about the communications of the pharynx. The pharynx extends from the base of skull to the lower border of the sixth cervical vertebra, which corresponds to the location of the cricoid cartilage of larynx, where it continues as esophagus. So the extent of pharynx is from the base of skull. Here you are seeing it communicating with the nasal cavity through posterior nares or internal nares, and the termination at the sixth cervical vertebra corresponding to cricoid cartilage, where it is continuing as the esophagus. So there is part of the pharynx immediately behind the nasal cavity, that is posterior nares, which is called the nasopharynx, and there is a part of the pharynx behind the oral cavity. This is the dorsal surface of the tongue, and then behind it is the oropharynx. And you can see the next part is called the laryngopharynx or hypopharynx, and which is ending at the level of the sixth cervical vertebra, where it continues with the esophagus. And this hypopharynx or the laryngopharynx communicates anteriorly with the larynx. This is the larynx. And if you see the nasopharynx, it is behind the basisphenoid and the arch of the first cervical vertebra, whereas the oropharynx part, it corresponds to the second and third cervical vertebra, the bodies of cervical vertebra and intervertebral discs you are seeing. And if you see the laryngopharynx, it is behind the, it's related to the 4th, 5th and 6th cervical vertebra. In this picture, you can see the three components of the pharynx, that is the nasopharynx, oropharynx and the laryngopharynx you are seeing. And in relation with the nasopharynx, there is the opening of the auditory tube you will see. And in relation with the oropharynx, there will be the palatine tonsil can be seen, and this is the laryngopharynx. So, which is continuous anteriorly with the larynx at the laryngeal inlet, which is formed by the epiglottis anteriorly. So, the functions of the pharynx, it's a passageway for both air and food. It's a resonating chamber for speech and sounds, and it is housing the palatine tonsils. And in addition, there is Wardeyer's lymphatic ring is there, which we are going to discuss separately. And because of the presence of these lymphatic aggregations, it is participating in the immunological reactions against the foreign bodies that are invading. So, the three anatomical parts from cranial to caudal in the pharynx or the nasopharynx, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. This is the posterior aspect of the pharynx. When the posterior wall of it is removed, then you can see the three components of the pharynx. So this is the nasopharynx, and here you are seeing the nasal septum, the two nasal cavities and the projecting middle and inferior concha with meatus of the nose, and this is the soft palate boundary between the nasopharynx and oropharynx you are seeing, and this is the uvula, okay, the downward projection from the soft palate you are seeing, and the dorsal aspect of the tongue you are seeing, which is the root of the tongue you are seeing. And you can see the palatine tonsils that are placed in relation with the dorsum of the tongue and between the two folds, okay, palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal folds. Then you are seeing the posterior part of the laryngopharynx, which becomes continuous with the esophagus, and you are seeing the laryngeal inlet formed by the epiglottis, then the array epiglottic folds and the arytenoid cartilages, the posterior aspect of them you are seeing. Here you can see the pharynx. This is the posterior view of it, and it is the musculature of the pharynx which you are seeing posteriorly. And if we make a midline incision extending from base of skull to downwards, then you can see the specimen like this, and you can see the conae, the posterior nares you are able to see. This is the nasopharynx area, and you can see the soft palate with the hanging uvula you are seeing, and this is the posterior surface of the tongue, and where you can see the lingual tonsils. Then this is the epiglottis, and this is the inlet of the larynx. The posterior surface of the larynx you are seeing. So this is the laryngopharynx, and this is the oropharynx, and this is the nasopharynx. Hope you have understood about the orientation and the subdivisions of the pharynx. Now let us look at the measurements of the pharynx. It is about 12 to 14 centimeters in length, and if you see the breadth, it is maximum at the nasopharynx. Here you can see it. It's about 3.5 centimeters, and it is minimum at the point where the laryngopharynx is continuous with the esophagus. So that is the pharyngoesophageal junction where it is about 1.5 centimeters. So this is the posterior view of the pharynx which we have already discussed, and the three subdivisions. So from the base of skull to the soft palate you are seeing, it is the nasopharynx, and from the soft palate to the epiglottis. Okay, you are seeing the oropharynx, and from the epiglottis to the level of the sixth cervical vertebra or cricoid cartilage where it becomes continuous with the esophagus. The divisions of the pharynx are the nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So you can see in this diagram the three components: the nasopharynx communicating with the nasal cavity, the oropharynx communicating with the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx communicating with the larynx and is also continuing with the esophagus. And the nasopharynx, it transmits only air and it is continuous with nasal cavity, and we have seen the auditory tubes opening into this part. The oropharynx transmits both air and food, and in relation with that we have seen the paired tonsils in its lateral wall. Coming to the laryngopharynx, it is inferior to oropharynx and behind the larynx. It is directing the air into the respiratory system and the ingested food into the esophagus. So, we are seeing the three components of the pharynx, and you are also seeing the vertebral relations for the three components. The nasopharynx related to the first cervical vertebra, and then the basisphenoid and occiput, these are the parts. Then there is the oropharynx related to the C2 and 3, and C4 to C6 related to laryngopharynx. So let us revise what you have learned in the present discussion about the pharynx. So it is divided into the three divisions, that is the nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. In the nasopharynx, if you see in the sagittal section of the head and neck, you can identify the nasopharynx behind the nose, and it is extending from the base of skull to the soft palate, and anteriorly it is communicating with the nose through posterior nares. So this is the part is the nasopharynx and its communication with the nasal cavity. Then coming to the next part, you can see that is the oropharynx, and it is behind the oral cavity and it extends from the soft palate, okay, to the upper border of the epiglottis. This is the epiglottis, and it is communicating above with the nasopharynx and below with the laryngopharynx and anteriorly with the oral cavity. The third part is the laryngopharynx, and it is behind the larynx, and it is extending from the upper border of epiglottis to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, and its communications are above it is communicating with the oropharynx and anteriorly with the larynx. This is the inlet of the larynx, and below it is communicating with the esophagus. In this picture you can see the inlet of the larynx clearly. So hope you have understood the divisions, the extent and the communications of the pharynx.